I don't always know anymore what actually happened and what I've just told myself so many times it became true. My name's Walter Greer. I'm 87 years old, and I've been sitting in this chair for about 20 minutes now, trying to decide where to start. I suppose that's the problem, isn't it? When you get to my age, everything has a before and an after, and sometimes you can't remember which side of the line you're standing on. My daughter set this camera up for me. She didn't ask what I wanted to say. She just said, "Dad, you keep talking about things at dinner that I think other people should hear." I told her I wasn't sure anyone would want to listen to an old man who can't always keep his decades straight. She left the room and didn't argue. That's how she is. She got that from her mother, the leaving without arguing. I'm not telling you this because I want you to feel something about me. I'm telling you this because I think you should know who's talking to you. I grew up in a small town in Ohio, Millbury. Most people have never heard of it, and that's fine. It was the kind of place where everyone knew which families had money and which ones were just quiet about not having it. We were the second kind. My father worked at a glass factory for 31 years. He came home every evening smelling like heat and something mineral I could never name. He wasn't a talker. He sat at the table, ate what was put in front of him, and went to bed early. I used to think that was just who he was, a man made of routine and silence. I didn't question it then. You don't when you're young. You think the people around you are simply their habits. It took me until I was nearly 60 to wonder if he had been unhappy. Not in a dramatic way, just quietly, the way a room can be cold without anyone mentioning it. And by 60, he had been gone for 11 years. I married young, 23. Her name was Elaine. I want to be careful how I talk about her because she's still alive. She lives about 40 minutes from here with our son, Paul. We've been divorced it'll be 29 years in March. When people find out we were married for 31 years and then divorced, they usually say something like, "Oh, that must have been hard." And I always say yes, because it's easier than saying what I actually think, which is that the divorce wasn't the hard part. The hard part was everything that came before it that neither of us said out loud. We were good at being a family, meals on time, vacations in August. We showed up to things. School plays, neighborhood gatherings, church at Christmas. We were present in all the ways that could be photographed. But there were conversations we never had. Not because we were cruel to each other, we weren't. We were just careful. We'd learned somewhere, both of us, that saying the difficult thing directly only caused damage, so we talked around things. For years. For decades. And eventually, talking around something for long enough starts to look like nothing happened at all. You forget what the original shape of it was. There's a specific evening I think about more than I should. It was winter. 1989, I believe, though I've gone back and forth on that. Paul would have been about 9. Margaret, our daughter, was 6. Elaine had made soup. I remember the soup because it was the good kind. The kind with the thick broth she only made when the weather got bad. She said something to me at the table. Not angry, just tired. She said, "Walter, I feel like I've been trying to get your attention for a long time." And I said, "I'm right here." And she looked at me in a way I didn't understand then, a way that I've spent years trying to decode from memory. She nodded slowly and went back to her soup. And I told myself I had answered her. I told myself "I'm right here" was a reasonable thing to say to someone who says they can't find you. I was sitting 2 feet away from her. I thought proximity was the same as presence. I honestly did not know the difference. Script. Part 2. The thing about a memory you've carried for a long time is that you start editing it without knowing. I've told myself that story about the soup so many times, in my head, alone, usually late at night, that I'm no longer certain I remember it exactly. Maybe the soup was a different night. Maybe she didn't say it quite that way. Maybe I responded differently and I've changed it to punish myself. Or maybe I've softened it to protect myself. That's what I mean when I say I've started forgetting which parts were true. I'm not losing my memory in the clinical sense. My doctor says I'm fine.
But there's a different kind of forgetting that happens when you revisit something too many times. Like a photograph that gets worn at the edges from handling. The image is still there, but you've touched it so much you're not sure what was original and what you filled in. And that uncertainty is its own kind of grief. Because you can't correct something you're not sure you're remembering accurately. Ball and I don't talk much. We're polite when we're together, which is 3 or 4 times a year. He's a good man. He works hard. His kids are healthy. He didn't turn out cruel or broken, which I used to take as evidence that I hadn't done too much damage. But a few years ago he said something to me. We were outside after Thanksgiving, just the two of us. He said, "You know what I remember most about being a kid? That I never knew what you were thinking." He wasn't angry when he said it. That's the part that sat heavy with me. He said it the way you'd state a fact. Like the color of the house we grew up in. I didn't know what to say. So I said, "I'm sorry about that." He nodded and went inside. I stood there for a while in the cold thinking about how my father used to come home from the factory and sat at the table without speaking, and how I used to wonder who he was on the inside. I hadn't thought about that in years. It came back all at once, standing in Paul's driveway with my hands in my coat pockets. I'm not telling you that I was a bad father. I don't believe I was. I provided. I stayed. I came to the things I was supposed to come to. But there's a difference between being there and being known. I didn't understand that distinction until it was too late to do much about it. By the time I understood it, my children were adults with their own families and their own carefully kept silences, and the window for a different kind of relationship had mostly closed. Not all the way, but mostly. You can repair things after a certain point, but you can't rebuild them. The structure is already what it is. You can patch the walls, but the floor plan doesn't change. Elaine and I had coffee once, maybe 8 years ago. Just the two of us, which hadn't happened in a long time. It wasn't planned. We were both at Margaret's house for a birthday, and we ended up in the kitchen while everyone else was outside. She asked me if I was happy. Not, "Are you doing well?" Not, "How are things?" She asked if I was happy. I told her I was content. I remember choosing that word deliberately. Content. She looked at me and said, "You always did prefer the smaller word." I laughed. She laughed a little too. And then Margaret came inside, and that was the end of it. I've thought about that exchange many times since. What she meant by the smaller word. Whether she was being unkind or just honest. Whether there's really a difference between those two things after enough years. Content. I chose it because it felt true. But I wonder now if I chose it because it asked less of the conversation. Script. Part 3. I'm not sure when I started to notice the forgetting. Not the facts. I can still tell you the address of every house I've lived in, the names of every supervisor I worked under, the make and model of the first car I owned. That part of my memory is still reasonably intact. What I've started losing is something harder to name. The texture of things. The emotional truth of a moment. I'll remember that something happened, but I won't remember how I felt when it happened. Or I'll feel something very clearly. A sadness, a warmth, and I won't be able to attach it to any specific event. It's like having a key with no lock. Or a lock with no key. You know something was there. You just can't find the other half. Margaret visited last month. She stayed for 4 days, which is the longest she stayed in years. On the second evening we sat on the back porch, and she asked me to tell me something I'd never told her. I thought she was joking at first, but she just sat there waiting, the way she does. I told her about a period when I was about 35, when I genuinely did not know who I was. Not a crisis, nothing dramatic. Just a long, quiet stretch of years where I went through every motion correctly and felt almost nothing doing it. Went to work, came home, did the right things, and somewhere under all of it, there was a person I'd stopped checking on. She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I knew something was off. I just thought it was me." She was 9 years old for most of that period. 9 years old, and she had absorbed something I thought I'd hidden completely. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't. I've been thinking lately about all the things I believed were private that apparently weren't. The distance I kept. The words I didn't say. The version of me I thought I was protecting everyone else from. I was so certain that if I kept it all quiet and inside, it wouldn't touch anyone. But children don't read words. They read the air in a room. They feel the temperature of you before you open your mouth. And I had been cold for years without realizing I'd let the heat go out. I don't have a tidy ending to any of this. I have a chair I sit in most mornings. I have a window I look out. I have a daughter who visits and a son who doesn't much. and an ex-wife who chose the honest word over the comfortable one, and was right too. I have a face I've looked at for 87 years that still surprises me sometimes in the mirror, not because I've aged. I've made my peace with that. But because I'll catch an expression I don't recognize, something passing through me that I didn't invite, and I'll wonder where it came from, what it's attached to, what parts of me I never got to know. I think that's the thing that settles on you at this age, if you're quiet enough to let it. Not regret, exactly. That's too clean a word for it. It's more like a slow awareness that you were living right next to your own life for a long time, and didn't quite realize it. That the real version of events, and the story you told yourself about them, drifted apart somewhere, and you never noticed the distance until it was already wide. I don't know which parts were true anymore. I know what I meant to be. I know what I tried to be. And I know that those two things, and the actual record of my days, are probably 3 different stories.